الثلاث الماضي العامة، رابع محاضرة عامة يقوم بها البروفيسور ديفيد ليون، مدير مركز دراسات المراقبة في جامعة كوينز كندا وأستاذ العلوم الاجتماعية والقانون. وهي المحاضرة رقم 14 بالنسبة لطلبة المساق أو مجموعة المحاضرات اللي على مدى 3 أسابيع التقوا وتابعوا النقاشات وتابعوا التدريب حول هذا الموضوع. ويسعدني اليوم بهذا الموضوع الشيق: الرصد والمراقبة في السياقات الاستعمارية، كيف يتم الحفاظ على القوة ومنظومات السيطرة بواسطة إدارة الإبصار والرؤية. موضوع محاضرة اليوم يسعدني أن يقودنا بالنقاش سواء بتقديم المحاضرة نفسها وموضوعها ولاحقا في التعليق على المحاضرة. يسعدني أن أقدم الدكتور أحمد سعدي، هو باحث فلسطيني له مساهمات عديدة في مجالات العلوم الاجتماعية والسوسيولوجيا السياسية، والذي حصل على الدكتوراه من جامعة مانشستر في المملكة المتحدة، ونشر أكثر من 40 مقالة علمية بلغات مختلفة في مجلات محكمة حول الحركات الاجتماعية والتعبئة السياسية والمراقبة وأدوات السيطرة على الأقليات في العالم، وبالأخص تلك التي تمارس على الفلسطينيين في الداخل. وهو مؤلف كتاب المراقبة الشاملة مع جامعة مانشستر بال2013، والذي يرصد ويحلل نقديا ابتكار إسرائيل لسياسات إدارة السكان والمراقبة والسيطرة السياسية للأقلية الفلسطينية في الداخل. كذلك قام بالتعاون مع ليلى أبو لغد بتحرير مؤلف كبير بعنوان النكبة فلسطين 1948 ومستحقات الذاكرة، والذي نشرته دار النشر التابعة لجامعة كولومبيا. شغل أيضا كرسي أركابيتا للأساتذة الزائرين في جامعة كولومبيا في نيويورك، وكان أيضا زميل باحث في جامعات شرق أوسطية شرق أسيوية في اليابان وسنغافورة. متأسف. فيعني لا يوجد يعني عندنا طموح أكثر من وجود متخصصين بهذا المجال في نفس الجلسة مثل اليوم، فنحن سعيدون جدا بانضمام الدكتور أحمد سعدي، وسعيدون أكثر باستمرار الدكتور ديفيد ليون بمجموعة المحاضرات. وأرى ونأمل أن نسمع مداخلات من الزملاء من العلوم السياسية والعلوم الاجتماعية، من أساتذة وطلبة. أهلا وسهلا اللي انضموا لنا لهذه المحاضرة العامة، ونأمل في فترة النقاش أن نستمع إلى ملاحظاتكم باتجاه ما سيتم تقديمه. بترك لرئيس الجلسة متابعة الجلسة. تفضل. شكرا.
أهلا وسهلا. مفروض أحكي بالإنجليزي فلغة الجلسة، كنت أفضل أكيد نتواصل من خلال اللغة العربية. Okay, welcome David. We are welcoming Professor David Lyon. And I want to say a few things before he gives his presentation. The first thing is that Professor David Lyon is one of the founders of a new subdiscipline in social sciences. It is immensely difficult not to follow a discourse in any subject in social sciences. Whenever you try to challenge dogmas, well-founded discourses, then the old guard, people who guard these discourses, will try to prevent you in publishing your thoughts, your ideas. Professor David Lyon was leading in establishing the subfield of surveillance studies. One important thing that Professor Lyon did, and I think it's very important, is that he used a Weberian definition of surveillance. That is surveillance as a value-free concept. Here in the Middle East and in the Arab world, we usually have, or the word surveillance has a definitely bad meaning It's how rulers, how dictators try to contain and control the population. However, surveillance, as it is used by Professor Lyon, is defined value-free, that is, it has its positive sides and its negative sides. And surveillance is part of our life. Whether we go to a supermarket or whether we travel in a certain company and so on, they keep records. And in fact, social sciences, if we look at it, the social sciences are part of surveillance. What do we do in sociology if not to make surveys and to follow the trends of changes among the population? Social sciences, in fact, are part of surveillance, and some governments use the social sciences for purposes of surveillance in the bad meaning. And a case in point is South Africa. They use the studies about the black population in order to control the population. And therefore, social sciences were a mean for governments. Of course, social sciences could be for both. Also, people who want to resist the surveillance in the bad meaning can use social sciences. And we know about Frantz Fanon and others. Anyway, I'll not take much of your time. I just wanted to add other two things. One thing is that controlled population, or in settler colonial context, population who are under the domination of the colonial power, usually constitute a laboratory for toying with, for experimental with the new ideas of surveillance. Israel is the land of surveillance for military equipment, for ideas about surveillance, and for control. In fact, one of the main exports of Israel are equipment related to surveillance. And they are using this on Palestinians. They say that these things were used, they are proven to work, they work, we use them and they are work. And then what is, how to say, one of the paradoxes of history, that these go back to the colonial population itself, in the metropolitan. Some of the techniques that Israel used to monitor and to screen Palestinian workers on the checkpoints are used now in Ben Gurion Airport. Another point which I think is very important is the question of population and the whole surveillance. In fact, the whole idea of surveillance is connected with the 18th century discovery of the notion of the population. All rulers knew what is population, but in the 18th century they developed a new concept of the population as an abstract concept, that you can break them to categories, that you don't look at them as only as human beings, but also as an abstract entity. And this notion of abstract entity, according to Michel Foucault, in fact, is the beginning of surveillance studies. Therefore, categorizing people, creating hierarchies among the different groups, and so on and so forth. In fact, one of the major tools of surveillance are census, are the gathering of data on the population itself. And enough with these words of introduction. I leave the floor for Professor Lyon. Please welcome with me Professor David Lyon.
Shukran Lakan. And many thanks for the kind welcome. It's very, very good to be here this afternoon. It has been good to be here over the last 3 weeks. We have very much enjoyed our stay here in Ramallah and at Beirzeit University, and we're very grateful for the kind invitation and welcome that we have received both here and in the city and many other places. We are truly grateful and glad to have spent some time with you. And we have learned a lot from being with you as well. So I'm going to say something this afternoon about surveillance and the settler colonial gaze. My subtitle is Monitoring and Managing in Israel-Palestine. I should say that I am not an expert on colonial studies. I have never lived in this part of the world, and my path into, my road into an interest in colonialism and settler colonialism in particular is through surveillance studies and through my contact with colleagues who have helped me understand a little bit about the kinds of surveillance that are present here. So I claim no expertise in this specific area. In fact, my colleagues at Beirzeit pushed me to speak about these issues, even though I don't feel qualified to do so. When it comes to the question time, I already told Professor Saidi that I would ask him to answer the questions because he really understands this stuff. So, surveillance is a key mode of power in today's world. It is a means of what I call monitoring for managing that can be seen at every single level, from global mass surveillance revealed by Edward Snowden over the past 2 years, right down to the micromanagement of everyday life. When I say monitoring for managing, I'm putting in 3 words. My longer definition, which would be that surveillance is the focused, systematic, routine attention to personal details, personal information, personal data, for some purpose, for the purpose of ensuring entitlement or protection, for control, for management, for influence. If there were people from a business school here, I would say that what you in the business school call marketing, I call surveillance. So it's really a set of practices that are similar across a whole range of areas. And as Professor Saidi said, I think of surveillance in that way that is always ambiguous. So in that sense, it is value neutral. It doesn't automatically tell you that surveillance is really great because it makes life so much more efficient and understandable and manageable. So I don't see surveillance as something that is, we should all aspire to be better surveillance agents. But nor do I see surveillance as something that is inherently sinister, socially negative, or evil. Surveillance can be understood in that value-free definition, but it is never, ever neutral. There is no such thing as neutral surveillance. It has to be understood in a context in which it is always amenable to ethical scrutiny and political contestation. Whatever kind, never neutral, but always ambiguous. Okay, surveillance in the digital era today is sometimes more subtle than ever. Lives are made visible to organizations as never before, while at the same time, the actual operation of those organizations becomes less and less obvious to those who are being surveilled. Also, such surveillance always has consequences. Consequences for many different groups of people, consequences that are made visible in various ways. It always has some consequences. Surveillance doesn't always work in the way that those who build the systems think it's going to work, but it still has consequences. Consequences perhaps for those who were really the intended targets of the surveillance. All kinds of things can happen. There will always be consequences, even though we can't predict necessarily what those consequences are. And such surveillance always has consequences, especially in a digital era, when social sorting aspects of surveillance, the categorizing, classifying aspects of surveillance, categorizing people so that different groups can be treated differently, these are facilitated even more than in pre-computer times. In situations such as Israel, Palestine, where surveillance is a constant and palpable presence, we can feel it, surveillance must be understood in specific ways. Primarily, I suggest, as serving the cause of settler colonialism. This particular form of the gaze has developed over decades, but is most marked today by its dependence on the digital, as well as its comprehensive coverage of everyday life. From the use of the census and of maps, to border controls and checkpoints, with identification systems, identification cards, and biometrics. Biometrics such as the iris scan that was tested on Gazan migrant workers and then used in an official way for Israeli military personnel, to its infiltration of work, education, commerce, and home and family life. Monitoring for management is a large-scale and central enterprise for coordination and control. So what I'm going to do is to introduce you to some of what I think of as some key sources for thinking about this area. I'm going to try to facilitate your own further research and thinking about this by introducing you to some people whose work I think is very important in the field. And through that, I look briefly at the ways that surveillance has developed in colonial settings, including Israel-Palestine, before turning to examine the ways that the digital works together with other modes of surveillance to create a surveillance matrix, I'm going to call it a surveillance assemblage, that is both 24/7, constant, always on, and ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So all the time, everywhere. In its penetration of everyday life. But this isn't a solid and fixed apparatus like the kind of thing that George Orwell envisioned in his novel 1984. And nor is it only run by the state. Increasingly, it's the product of state and commercial enterprises working together, hand in hand. It's a liquid and shifting assemblage. It mutates all the time. It moves with the moment. It has many varied aspects, many objects, many things are part of it that just work together. And identifying them at any given time is necessary because it changes, it mutates, it moves. And it depends on flows of different kinds of phenomena. Different things are flowing within this moving assemblage of surveillance. Phenomena such as fingerprints, police records, iris scans, informers, organizational priorities. All these kinds of things form an assemblage. It isn't Big Brother as a centralized entity. It's a much more moving thing than once envisioned. So while this form of surveillance has many interconnections, it's complex and could even be described as integrated, it's also a flexible form of control that can shift and reshape itself in an ongoing way, depending on circumstances, events, availabilities, priorities, political exigencies, whatever. So in the end, I want to examine some ways that surveillance in such situations may be also questioned, negotiated, perhaps subverted or resisted, and why it's important to care about those things. No one in today's world can say with impunity, oh, it's only my little records, why should they care about me? I'll just go on with my life as it is. I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to worry about. That idea in the 21st century is a pernicious lie. It does not help us in any way. Because although it may be a desirable situation to say, I've done nothing wrong, I have nothing to hide, why would I worry? The fact is that we are not judged on who we are and what we have done. We are increasingly judged on what we might do in the future. We are judged on the basis of who our friends and contacts are. It's the classification into which we fall that makes all the difference, not that we happen to have lived upright, righteous, and law-abiding lives. So let's clear that idea out of the way. It's important that we think about why we should care about surveillance in the 21st century. In the digital era, as I say, opportunities for intensified surveillance multiply. But the chances for modes of resistance and questioning also are opened at the same time and using the same technologies. These are all part of a more general ethical and political question relevant to current conditions of modernity, but they have a particular immediacy in intense environments such as surveillance for settler colonialism. So let me start introducing you to some works that I think are helpful in our understanding. I have had a colleague at Queen's University since 1990. We first got in touch in 1984. What a significant year to get in touch with somebody in surveillance studies. So I was in touch with Elias Zurich from 1984, and then I became his colleague in 1990. And I have learned more from working with Elia Zurich over those years than from any other single person in the field. And we have run many events together, done research together, argued with each other, done all the things that professors do together. So I have a lot to be thankful for in my colleague and friend Elia Zurich. And his work goes a long way to showing how population management, what Michel Foucault calls biopolitics, is especially visible in the colonial context. As sovereignty gave way to discipline and then to what Foucault calls governmentality, as the state tried to defend society, so categories, classifications, especially racially and ethnically organized ones, are used in the interests of some segments of the population. And we'll see in the course of what I have to say how this works out. I'll give you some examples later on. And at the same time, territory is controlled in the name of security. So much happens in the 21st century under the sign of security. In one of the lectures that I gave earlier, I was suggesting that the argument that security is replacing politics in the 21st century is a very important one for us to consider. That security in some ways is undermining and eliminating politics itself is a good debate to have. If we're controlling territory in the name of security, areas have to be guarded, such as, for example, in native reservations in North America. What David Harvey, the geographer, calls economic accumulation by dispossession automatically produces refugees and dependent labor. And once you have refugees, dependent labor, that too prompts forms of surveillance to be able to manage those groups. Increasingly, as you're well aware, Palestinians are obliged to live in reservation-like enclaves, some more intense than others, but nonetheless enclaves, bounded by separation walls and checkpoints, complete with their observation towers, cameras, and all the other paraphernalia of the surveillance apparatus. Surveillance gives an elevated vantage point. It's a gaze from above. We were talking about this in our little class yesterday. This fixes and identifies those who are being colonized. Okay, the gaze from above fixes, identifies, and objectifies those who are under observation. As I say, Elia Zurich shows how the kind of surveillance that happens in colonial contexts is also seen in maps, in the census, in fingerprinting, things I mentioned already, as well as in the literal gaze, that which is seen with the eye, the ocular, from supervisors to cameras. This surveillance works, as Zurich and others have argued, by means of fear, risk, and uncertainty. And the uncertainty helps to generate fear. And that becomes the basis of a whole regime. It's also augmented by new technologies all the time. As was mentioned in the introduction, the Homeland Security industry of Israel is a global Homeland Security industry. Israel is one of the capitals, the hubs of Homeland Security industry, so is selling all kinds of equipment and techniques around the world, from radio frequency identification through biometrics, drones. Drones are always surveillant. Whatever they do, whether they're armed or not, they're always surveillant. That's how they work. Audio surveillance, social media, all are ways of producing evidence, obtaining information about populations. I mentioned social media again in the class. We have been talking about the ways in which social media have become increasingly important today. And in this case, the evidence producing aspect of these devices has been tremendously, has produced a burgeoning, a mushrooming, a huge growth of surveillance techniques as we ourselves, in our cell phone use and our connection with others through social media, are generating information that is being used. And frequently, it's not just us generating it, it's our devices that generate further data. So one of our colleagues in this field says that we should not talk only about the devices that we use in everyday life as objects. This is a play on English words, which might be difficult, but not as objects, but as logjects. That is to say, these are objects that record their own use as they go. So if you're on a bicycle, it doesn't record your use of the bicycle. If you're on an old-fashioned dial-up telephone, it doesn't record your own use of the machine. But cell phones and using the internet records your use the whole time. So the evidence that is produced by your use of those technologies is constantly being generated and transmitted and collected and used and aggregated and sorted and analyzed for surveillance. Ilya Zurich has a new book coming out this year. The book is called Israel's Colonial Project in Palestine. Brutal Pursuit. It comes from Routledge and should appear in July. And in my humble opinion, it's going to be a blockbuster. This is a really important book that is coming out. And the kinds of things that I've just been saying are the sorts of things that he discusses in detail in Israel's Colonial Project in Palestine. And he uses the concept of settler colonialism in a systematic way to assess the Zionist project from the 19th century to the present, focusing on biopolitics or population management. He looks at territory. He looks at state security to show how surveillance is used in the control of Palestinian populations in Israel and the occupied territories. So the colonial gaze is not something new. It is something that has developed over a very long time. And it's been visible in various contexts. Michel Foucault again says this, and I quote, "Colonization obviously transported European models to other continents and had a boomerang effect on the mechanisms of power in the West and on the apparatuses, the institutions, and the techniques of power. A whole series of colonial models were brought back to the West, and the result was that the West could practice an internal colonialism on itself." This was mentioned in the introduction and needs to be elaborated. Much fruitful work has been done over recent years on the colonialism surveillance connection and on how colonial powers first test new techniques in colonial situations and then bring them back to the colonizing country in their improved forms. So again, we've discussed in class how Alfred McCoy, for example, describes in a huge book the ways in which the American CIA, Criminal Investigation Agency, began in the Philippines during American adventures in Southeast Asia, before being returned along with the director of the Philippine Security Agency to the United States. Started in the Philippines and then in its tested form was taken back to be developed in the US. One of my PhD students, Midori Ogasawara from Fukuoka, Japan, is looking at the ways in which Japanese adventures in Manchuria, the invasion of Manchuria in the 1930s, China, led the Japanese colonial powers to set up an identification system for the local colonized population. And that system that they were setting up in Manchuria became the basis for an identification system that would be used later, starting in Tokyo and moving throughout Japan. And today, in its computerized version, it's called JukiNet. And JukiNet originated really in Manchuria. In the Israeli case, surveillance technologies and techniques are built and perfected within the homeland security industry, having been tested on Palestinians. At airports, for example, everything from body scanners through ethnic profiling to behavioral observation has been tested at Ben Gurion Airport. Unlike other colonial systems, the testing is for local trial and error improvements and then prepared for export to the global security and surveillance marketplace. Let's get a bit closer to home and narrow down a bit further. In the case of Israel-Palestine, we need to think about some more particular ways that this works out. Now, the social sciences are always searching for concepts that will help us to understand social processes and practices, to explain and interpret what we see and experience. And this is a process of constant refinement, trying to find theories that seem to best explain the phenomena before us. One key concept, as I say, that's being debated and discussed in this context is settler colonialism. According to Patrick Wolfe, settler colonialism has some specific aspects. For example, it refers to the structuring of a society, not just to events in the history of a society. Second, it indigenizes settlers. It turns settlers into apparently indigenous people and does the opposite to the indigenous people, to make indigenous people seem like outsiders. So it's a sort of identity transference process. And then thirdly, the logic of settler colonialism is the elimination of the native groups. And one of the people that has helped me understand this is my colleague who's right here, Ahmed Saidi. And his work goes a long way to showing how, in practice, Israeli settler colonialism developed in Palestine. The intensive government debates on power and its exercise in the new state of Israel, held between 1948 and 1952, culminated in what he calls the Israeli discourse of the Palestinians. Power, he says, generates modes of thought that become taken to be common sense. Palestinians were the other, first for exclusion, and then reluctantly for management during the transition, or the hoped-for transition, to exclusion. As time went on and few remaining Palestinians looked likely to depart, attention shifted more and more not to how to exclude, but how to control them through various means: education, identity, spatial distribution, and whatever might lead to voluntary emigration. They certainly discussed democracy, as Professor Saidi shows from his careful study of the documents from the archives. They discussed democracy, they discussed equality, they discussed the rule of law, but citizenship for Palestinians was never, ever taken seriously. No doubt the results of today's elections will give us a further commentary on just that fact. A key technique was to develop separate bureaucracies to deal with different groups, so that Palestinians would have no solid political rights, and in which those Palestinians would become dependent on official bodies. This provided a rationale for Israeli policy, but never countenanced the possibilities for other modes, alternative modes of living together, of coexistence. The discourse was translated into mental images of Palestinians. Discourse is fundamental. On the one hand, Israeli Jews would enjoy group rights, while on the other, the Palestinians would be a collective of non-Jews, divided by faith, ethnicity, and even locality. Jews would become more integrated by this system, Palestinians less integrated. And such segmentation was part of the plan in 1958, but was even supported, as was mentioned in the introduction, in this case by social science research in Israel, underpinning the idea of a natural order, actually constructed through surveillance practices that allowed for further deep supervision and control. And this echoes Foucault, once again, for whom surveillance and control is a machinery both immense and minute, that supports, reinforces, multiplies the asymmetries of power. And this develops further with the segmentation capacities of contemporary big data surveillance in the 21st century, seen especially through the Edward Snowden revelations, and what is now called OSINT, open source intelligence. That is to say, how security agencies can use social media and cell phone data as a source of intelligence information. Many other categories exist in the world of intelligence gathering. OSINT is now the most important because of that user-generated content that I was referring to before. And that is very much in use here, and the Snowden revelations show that it is in use here, and it shows direct links between the NSA and the ISNU in Israel, and therefore also with the PA. So it extends the means of subdividing on the basis of nuance, preference, commitment, purchases, contacts, exchanges within the diversity of Palestinian society. A few years ago, with Ilya Zurich and Yasmin Abu-Laban, who's at the University of Alberta in Canada, we organized a research workshop, and the papers from that eventually came out as a book called Surveillance and Control in Israel, Palestine. My part in that book was to show a little bit about how the ID card system works within Israel, Palestine. And I quoted Amir Haas, who said in 2007 in Haaretz, the roadblocks, the fence, and the prohibitions against entering the country for everyone who is not Jewish are different levels in this system of separation. Categorization again, you see. The smart cards, she said, fit the picture in a natural way that strikes fear in anyone who understands that peace and separation are contradictory terms. And I try to explain in my chapter in the book how those cards work with their color coding and so on and so forth, and put them in a broader context. And as you're well aware, if you're not on the computer base, you don't exist. And we could go on to bring Giorgio Agamben into that story and talk about how ID cards help to determine who is available only for what he calls bare life. But I want to talk a little bit about another person, Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian. She too has a new book coming out this year, and that book too I think is going to be really very important. That book is called Security Theology, Surveillance and the Politics of Fear, from Cambridge University Press next month. And she details poignantly Palestinian experiences of life and death within settler colonialism. She exposes how what she calls Israeli security theology, surveillance and fear, obscure violence and power while maintaining the power structures. Israeli security theology establishes the Palestinian body, time, and space as the unworthy other, reproducing colonial power. And this, as it were, picks up where Professor Saidi's work leaves off, in developing this in different ways and in very contemporary ways. Her work is a vital feminist analysis of the intimate politics of the everyday, focusing on the Palestinian body, family life, memory, birth, and death as sites of surveillance that produce and sustain a political economy of fear that justifies further colonial violence. She discusses ways that in her own neighborhood of East Jerusalem, those intimate encounters of violence take place, where people can't give birth without state scrutiny and obstacles, and they can't even die without their funerals being disrupted by the same surveillant gaze and dehumanizing regimes. People walking through East Jerusalem with a casket carried on their shoulders can be pushed to one side in an attempt to disrupt even the rituals of death itself. So hers is an analysis that is very intimate. It has to do with our bodies, our lives, our families, our births, our deaths. And it seems to me that that kind of work is needed as well to support and to offer a counterpoint to the other kinds of surveillance studies of settler colonialism that I've been describing. She speaks of home demolitions, of children being harassed in the street, of Palestinian women being raped as a dimension of colonial practice, all showing how the discourse of Palestinians, with which we began a few minutes ago, creates everyday realities of humiliation and violence. And as she says, and I quote, "The surveillance of the colonized involves historic injustices, coercive power of ongoing dispossession that manufactures the colonizer as superior and simultaneously denies the colonized the right to home, family, society, dignified living." So what do we say in the face of all this? My time's almost up. I just want to make a few remarks on how to respond? Are there any prospects within a situation like this for resistance, for change, for a different situation to emerge? Many have been discussed, of course, over many years. One of the most interesting concerns technologies that are currently in debate internationally, especially following the Snowden revelations, those of the internet and social media. The same technologies that are indeed harnessed for repressive and colonial purposes still carry within them opportunities for other uses. Both Zurich and Shalhoub Kevorkian themselves have done studies that relate precisely to those kinds of activities, discussing the potential for subversion, negotiation, resistance, using the internet and cell phone technologies that I've just been describing in terms of their surveillance capacities. Each draw on fascinating case studies, and I can give you references to important work that they have done that show how it works out in practice. Shalhoub Kevorkian talks about e-resistance. E-resistance, how a new generation is using the new technologies to resist oppression and to, quote, emancipate their bodies, spaces, and lives. Text messages that alert others to roadblocks and alternative paths, taking pictures of violent attacks, spreading them on social media, taking pictures of incursions into women's privacy, resisting militarization in cyberspace. Generally, she concludes, justice-seeking criminology, she's in a criminology department, should look at e-resistance as a means of challenging the existing security industry. Instead of building walls, checkpoints, and modes of marking the body, space, and life of the living and the dead, she says, we should invest in building a just world. I said at the beginning that surveillance is always ambiguous, but never neutral. It invites ethical scrutiny and political contestation wherever it occurs. Those ethics may be developed in a number of different ways and from different sources, but I think there is widespread agreement on some important matters about human rights as founded in human dignity, never on the basis of any specific group, but on human dignity. On human life being about embodied persons in relation. Embodied, not objectified, abstract. And on human flourishing in every aspect of life as that which connects hope with today's daily realities. A note for you university students who are in the majority here this afternoon. While the university is a space for open and free inquiry, not governed by political ideology or economic direction, there's a chance to develop right here perspectives and practices that can contribute to such human flourishing beyond the limits of those economic, political, and cultural forces that would deny and thwart it. Neither global mass surveillance nor unrestrained capitalist power, and not even systems like settler colonialism, are either inevitable or irreversible. I'm not here to tell you how to respond. I live in Canada, and we have plenty of problems with our own government, our own Prime Minister, many issues that we have to deal with. So I'm not going to pretend to come to you and tell you how you should respond. But I'm hoping that the kinds of things that I've said might give you some clues about how you might work those out. In my situation, I reject complacency, abjection, resignation on the one hand, and the politics of revenge on the other. I believe with all my heart that it is possible to seek ethical and peaceful routes to justice that will undermine and dismantle surveillance systems whose features are coercive, objectifying, and destructive of trust and mutual care. Shukran lakan.
Well, we don't have much time really left, but I just wanted to make one comment. In fact, there was a big project in Japan, the United Nations University in Japan, and that project aims to look at security from a different dimension. And always security meant a human security. That is the security of the individual. And contrary to the security that state agencies, military organizations, or semi-military organizations, and so on, are developing, there is another kind of, I would say, option for understanding security, and that is human security. Human security from fear, from ignorance, from sickness, and so on. And I think we shouldn't take the concept of security and leave it to those organizations of control, of subjugation, but we should also work on the concept of security by making it, again, a value-free concept and ask what about the security of the individual as a human being. I'll stop here, and we now will have Q&A. The floor is open for questions, and Professor Lyon shall try to answer your questions. Well,
did you think we should give them a moment just to stretch, or
we have 25 minutes.
You've got a question anyway.
Yeah. Yes, please.
مرحبا، حمزة من كلية الاقتصاد والتجارة، طالب سنة رابعة. الحكي اللي حكاه بنقدر أول إشي بعذر على التشبيه اللي بدي أحكيه، بس بنقدر نشبهه إنه القوى الاستعمارية هي عبارة عن دكتور، وإسرائيل هي القفص اللي بيحتجز الفأر اللي هو الشعب الفلسطيني اللي بيقوموا عليه التجارب. هل هذا الإشي إنه بقدر أعتبره سبب آخر لتمسك القوى الاستعمارية لإسرائيل والوقوف بجانبها؟ السؤال الثاني، النظام المراقبة اللي هو حكى عنه، هل بقدر أحكي إنه هو نظام بقدروا يستغلوه على الصعيد الاقتصادي بحيث إنه يتنبأوا بتذوق الفرد، اللي شو السلع اللي بتذوق فيها الفرد اللي بده إياها الفرد، يستغلوها وينتجوا السلع اللي هم بدهم إياها؟ شكرا.
He asked two questions. One question is the fact that Israel can pioneer in these technologies of surveillance makes it especially valuable for colonial powers. And the other question, really, what he asked is about marketing. That sometimes they give you a product that you want in order to try to sell the products that they want to sell. Do you want to take a few questions or just one question?
Well, I think one question at a time.
Okay,
be enough.
One question then.
Okay. So let me just speak to the marketing question. Like I say, surveillance can be used in many different kinds of ways. And when I say that surveillance can be synonymous with marketing in some ways, I'm simply referring to the fact that it's a set of techniques. It's a way of finding information in order to improve management or whatever. In this case, for the marketing of products and services. It doesn't stop it being surveillance, but yes, of course, I already joked with my class that often Amazon actually gets it right. And I discovered that, yes, there are books that I wasn't aware of that I would be very interested in, and I thank Amazon for showing me what they are. But that doesn't mean that I'm not critical of other ways in which Amazon itself might act. Amazon's, what the Snowden revelations have shown about Amazon's working with the National Security Agency doesn't thrill me quite as much as finding books that I would really like to read. So, for the sake of time, I'll leave your other question. If you want to stay behind at the end, I'll try to answer it. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a mixed, you can take it as a comment and you can take it as a question. When I heard the talk in the beginning, I agree with most of the notions you said about surveillance, not inherently evil, because I am not an essentialist. However, there is an element that even Foucault, the theoretician that you've chosen to quote, says that there is a power structure in surveillance. If I do not see power as a structure, as power structure reflected in surveillance, then I'll escape the point of why surveillance is always even ending up on the negative side of ethics, if you want, on the immoral rather than amoral object. Even when I can imagine a scenario like Amazon or the doctor putting me under surveillance because they want to value my blood levels or, I don't know, levels of sugar and diabetes, that's also a control out of power. He is telling me that he knows best about my body and how it functions. Because of this power structure, I think when you're thinking of, if you want to extend the point to colonial studies, then you see why it's also a continuation of the colonization, a continuation of the power that is inflicted upon a segment of people or one person. I didn't hear you talk of power structure, and I wonder why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question or comment. There are many things that one could say about this. Of course, Foucault also understands power to be productive, and that productivity of power may well be to socially beneficial ends as socially negative ones. I think it's important to maintain a sense of the ambiguity of surveillance and a definition that sees it as ambiguous but never neutral. So that it can always be questioned and subverted if necessary, or accepted within limits if it is apparently appropriate, subject to further analysis. My position on Foucault is very mixed. Of course, I quote Foucault. Foucault has become a major figure in surveillance theory, and I don't want to deny his importance. At the same time, I'm very critical of many of the things that Foucault argues. I also believe that Foucault misses some very important points. His reticence even to talk about electronic media and the very systems that today dominate the surveillance environment. We can't only listen to Foucault. There are many, many other theorists who I think are helping us to understand situations. In the context of settler colonial gaze, my overall feeling is that that it's very difficult not to construe surveillance in a negative way, because the driving force is settler colonialism, which I regard as inhumane, unjust, inappropriate. And so if surveillance is being driven by a certain set of, by a certain kind of machinery, then it can never be just, fair, or contribute to human flourishing. So I'm not denying that for a moment. But I still think it's important to look at that as we look at technologies in general, as not as inherently socially negative, but having capacities that may be shaped towards human flourishing ends and may be shaped towards ones that support anything but human flourishing. So it's an ambivalent position, but I do think that if surveillance if the key motif of surveillance lies in something like settler colonialism, it's very hard to see any virtue in it whatsoever. Yeah, yes. George, just deciding who you're asking questions. I don't know.
Just quick question. You used the term assemblage at the beginning, assemblage, and I'm just curious, where did you, like, what's the theoretical history of the notion of assemblage? Is it from the art field, or more like Deleuzian use of it? And why not structure? Because you talked about state control, capitalist enterprises. So it's like, why not structure and clear instead of like this fluid term and not kind of saying everything and nothing? It's just curious about the use of the term. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. It's not everything and nothing. I mean, I was trying to be specific about some aspects of it. But sure, I would say that the origin of the way that I'm using it there is very much in the work of Deleuze, but not only Deleuze, Deleuze and Guattari, and the way that they, again, argue with Foucault. I think that the notion of the assemblage helps us just by pointing to the ways that there are, at the very least, soft edges and malleable aspects of surveillance. And I do believe that the increasing digitization of surveillance increases the liquidity of the processes. It becomes more fluid as the possibilities for, in this case, personal data flows increases. And as those data flow within and between different kinds of organizations, and now, as we know from Snowden, within and between different countries in this global mass surveillance regime, it isn't a solid, top-down, Big Brother, state-oriented surveillance. It is something much more moving, mutating, malleable. And it's that I'm getting at. And again, I'm not denying the importance of specific state activities, specific corporate activities, or even a kind of hegemony of a global network of corporate and state-oriented agencies that are now working together beyond the realm of any national or corporate bloc activity. There is something beyond all those, but I would argue that even that is still an assemblage. It's moving, it's mutating, it's flowing. So the liquidity is something that I think is important to acknowledge, and also the fact that many different kinds of activities and objects and phenomena can be included in the assemblage. So, you know, while we might talk about social media surveillance and the ways that it operates in contemporary Palestine, at the same time, there are informers. And informers might still be an important part of that situation. Human beings using their eyes and ears and reporting back. So they are part of the assemblage as well. So it also unites the hyper-technology approaches and old-fashioned forms of labor-intensive surveillance. So I think the assemblage captures a lot there. But we'd have to argue about it in specific instances to really make sense of it. I was referring to it in a fairly loose way just to make the point, not to talk about specific instances.
Well, if I just add one small thing to this, if we look at it now in quantitative social sciences, the cutting edge really is, if we look at the quantitative social sciences today, the cutting edge is the development of methodologies relating to network analysis. You have to understand how this network analysis is connected with the rising or the increasing import of surveillance. It's not something fixed, but you have the core of the network, and you have various networks connecting together and so on. And these network analyses are connected with the development of surveillance. And this is exactly what David referred to, kind of liquidity of the surveillance. We don't have categories. Categorical statistics is not really the state of art now. And this is kind of relations between two fields. Yeah.
There's other questions.
But I'm talking about the structure of it.
Okay, maybe in
There
the
were questions back in the middle.
yeah, maybe
There's one in the back.
we have here, and I should
I think Dahlia had one.
Ah,
There's one in
yeah,
the back.
please. Yeah.
So I have a little comment concerning what Dr. Lyon was saying. I have the to say that we are not familiar with saying with describing the American foreign policy as the American colonialism. That is, unlike the traditional imperialism, is practicing power through data and through surveillance. Here I would like to emphasize on not only on the engagement of the U.S. Foreign policy in the worldwide conflicts, but also in the way that the U.S. is managing these conflicts through the technologies, through energy distribution worldwide. And we can here take in mind the U.S. relations with the Gulf countries and how they have cooperation that is essential for the U.S. for in the case of distributing energy, and so it's also has a political economy aspect that is also crosses with the marketing and economic operations worldwide, and for the knowing the consuming behavior, all these aspects inside the economic side. So my question can be elaborated in this context as: can we say that surveillance, in its wide meaning, can be used by a unilateral way by the U.S. for controlling what is going on in the world in means of wars, maybe for distributing ideas of democracy, and for the globalization aspect also that goes with the flow of all these operations that the U.S. is doing worldwide. So, thank you.
Thanks for the question. There are ways in which the activities of the U.S. outweigh in capacity any other power bloc in the world, including for the surveillance of what you were talking about, energy sources, power relations between energy producers, and so on and so forth. And it's clear that the U.S., because of the way that it has helped to direct the building of fiber optic cables all around the world that carry our internet traffic, through the control of satellites, in all these ways, the U.S. has the kind of upper hand and the potential for a sort of overwhelming power within that domain. But at the same time, it's become clear, and again clear after Snowden, that the U.S. never operates on its own. It's always working with partners, and with partners, direct partners, and looser allies. So it's a much bigger situation than can be described in more simple terms of American dominance in the field. But certainly the kinds of surveillance that are going on are not only of the kind that you might describe as national security oriented or anti-terrorism oriented. Clearly there's an awful lot of economic surveillance that goes on. One country examining the mining and extractive industries of another, looking at the industrial development of another. So the kinds of surveillance that go on are manifold, even through those agencies that, of which the NSA is the sort of archetypical figure. Still a guy at the back too.
I would like to speak in Arabic because I think the message is mainly for the students. اللي بدي أحكيه إنه هذا كثير موضوع مهم، ويعني بجوز هذا أول شخص بيحكي عن موضوع اللي هو بالنسبة لنا موضوع حياة أو موت. يعني خلينا نقول بدي أحكي في قصة مثلا إنه أكثر من 400 واحد استشهدوا بسبب البليفون مثلا في الانتفاضة الثانية. وبتعرفوا البليفون بدأ باستشهاد عياش بال96. Is the translator, because otherwise I will speak in English. translator عم بيترجمه. فالشغلة مذهلة إنه إحنا بنستنى ل 2015 حتى يجي محاضر. بعدين الشغلة كمان المذهلة إنه كم أستاذ من الجامعة هاي جاي يحضر هذا الموضوع اللي هو زي ما قلت قصة حياة أو موت. الإسرائيليين يعني موضوع السيرفيلانس زي ما قال هم الحقيقة بدأوا وأنتجوا يعني هم اللي أدخلوا مثلا السيارات الملغومة. أنا بدي أحكي بالعنف، هم اللي أدخلوا الطرود الملغومة. أول ناس اخترعوا واحد يشيكل في التاين بال40 يعني. بس لما الأمر اليومي بإنشاء الشاي بال1941 كان في الأمر اليومي اللي صدر إنه بما في ذلك في مخادع نومهم. لما الأمر اللي هذا كان موجود. وواحدة من الأشياء المذهلة لما اشتغلت في أرشيف اليونايتد نيشن بال2004 إنه اكتشفت إنه الطاقم الأوبزيرفرز تبعون اليونايتد نيشنز كانوا وايرد في تل أبيب يعني. بس عمرها ما اليونايتد نيشن ما عملت فضيحة لها. فإحنا يعني بنواجه خصم اللي هو تطور هاي الأشياء، وهو زي ما قال يعني هو أحد بجوز حتى أكثر من الولايات المتحدة في موضوع المراقبة والسيكيورتي. إحنا بنعرف حتى في مطارات أمريكية الخبرات الإسرائيلية هي اللي بتتشغل. أوكي، فإنه مذهل يعني غريب إنه إحنا ليش إحنا مش قادرين يعني نواجه. وكيف هلا مع السوشيال يعني ميديا عم فظيع. يعني أنا بشوف الطلاب في انفتاح والناس بتحكي كل إشي والإشي اللي أحكته كيفوركيان عن إنه مش عارف الناس بتبعت مسج إنه والله هي في حاجز. أوكي، هذا مش إشي مقابل، مش إشي مضاد الحقيقة للسيرفيلانس. السيرفيلانس بده استراتيجي كبيرة جدا، بده فهم وبده هدول الناس اللي ما بعرفش أنا قديش من هدول 200 طالب هم جايين عشان بس يسمعوا لأنه في دورة، ولا عشان هم شايفين إنه هم بدهم يكون لهم دور في إنه يواجهوا هذا الإشي الإسرائيلي. زي ما إحنا مثلا لحد هلا أنا متأكد دائرة الكيمياء عمرها ما حاولت تشتغل على إنه كيف نواجه شو نوع القنابل المسيلة للدموع. هذا كمان بيلقي نظرة على المضبوط على دور الجامعة، كيف احنا كمان الجامعات وكيف نخلق وكيف قصة بحاجة لوعي جديد للمواجهة. وشكرا.
I'll answer that question, not directly, but I'll say something about it. In my research, I found that the Israelis emphasized that they wanted to teach Arab women and to raise their standards about the Palestinians inside Israel. And one of the reasons is to decrease the number of children, as there is a negative correlation between women's education and the number of children that they bring. And some Palestinians ask me, what do you suggest? Do you want our women to stay at home and to have plenty of children? Of course, the question is not, but you need a comprehensive strategy in order to counter the Israeli system of thought. It's a system of thought, and you need a counter system of thought. And as Professor Lyon said, surveillance is a means to an end, and it's just a means. It's not the end in itself. And the question we should ask ourselves, what are our ends, priorities, and how can we achieve them?
Yeah, I had a comment too, which is that, and I'm glad you think it's an important area, and that's why I'm here. I think it's a very important area. This was the last in a series of 4 lectures, and in other lectures I kind of answered your question. Of course, I don't believe that micro-strategies of using social media to subvert the ways in which checkpoints and borders and so on are used is somehow going to turn everything around. I wasn't suggesting that at all. All I was saying was that those kinds of micro-strategies are not irrelevant and they are not insignificant. They actually contribute to a whole way of thinking about how to use new technologies in alternative ways. So that's all that I was saying about that. As for the general, the broader question of how we confront these issues within the university, totally agree. I would argue that the kinds of surveillance that we confront in Canada, as in Palestine, has to be talked about and discussed and debated and politically contested on every level. It is something that is not just to do with our little practices using social media and cell phones. It has to do with encouraging software designers and computer scientists to think about ways in which they produce their technologies in a way that has built-in protections. Whether that's encryption or whatever the other system may be developed to increase the possibilities for online security. There's a huge task for engineers, computer people, at the level of policy in so many areas. Organizations need to take much more seriously how they handle personal data. Personal data has consequences not on abstract bits of data, but on actual flesh and blood lives. Embodied people in social relations are affected by the ways in which we analyze any organization. I mean by we, any organization uses personal data. People out on the streets because of a bill that is before Parliament that would allow increased police powers to collect and retain certain kinds of data, that expands the definition of terrorist or terrorist activity. Political action is also needed. In our case, it was on the streets. I was sorry that I missed it, but I heard all about it, and it's very important to organize at that level too, but also at the level of democratic action actually in policy making. There's work to be done at every single level. This is something that affects all of our lives. It is growing at a very rapid pace. It has the power of huge nation states and international networks behind it. It also has economic power hugely behind it. These are things that we ought to be discussing at every level. So don't imagine that I was referring to the Shalub Kevorkian and Zurich and Miriam Al-Khal and other studies as sort of micro scale and irrelevant to the big picture. I think there are arguments for a new kind of politics of surveillance that needs to be developed based on informed understanding of what's actually happening at every level and increasingly working together, helping each other. Parents and teachers helping kids to know how they should go online, how they should live online, which is how so many people live today. There are so many areas in which we need to be confronting these very issues. So forgive me if I gave the impression that there were not bigger things to do than checking how we use our phones and internet.
Student, final question.
نظام المراقبة هو مشروع مركزي هو حكى إنه المراقبة هو مشروع مركزي لتنسيق الثقافي. شو بقصد في التنسيق الثقافي؟ إنه محو الثقافة لشعب معين أو للتجمعات اللي قصد عنها، وخلق نظام ثقافي أو ثقافة لهذه الشعوب بحيث أنها بتتكيف مع القوى الاستعمارية ومع الحركة الصهيونية.
Could you repeat the question in a slightly different form?
أنت حكيت إنه النظام أنت حكيت إنه المراقبة هو مشروع مركزي للتنسيق الثقافي. شو بتقصد بالتنسيق الثقافي؟ هل إنه بتقصد بتمحي ثقافة شعب معين وبتخلق ثقافة ثانية عشان تتكيف مع الحركات الصهيونية والقوى الاستعمارية ولا إيش؟
Okay, I think you're referring to what I was saying about settler colonialism and the ways in which, according to Patrick Wolf, one of the key aspects of settler colonialism is to eliminate the native. So that was what was being talked about there, and then I elaborated that in relation to how surveillance might be used to fulfill those purposes of settler colonialism. That's I think what I was saying. I wasn't referring to other things. I was only referring to the ways in which surveillance might be guided by that element of settler colonialism. Does that make sense? Okay.
Okay, شكرا للجميع ويعطيكم العافية.
Wonderful to work with you. Well, welcome everyone. It seems that this class has grown this afternoon. We're a bigger class than before. Amazing. In Canada, I often find that the size of the class diminishes over time. Here, the class seems to grow. So, I don't know what it is about Beirzeit University, but students come out of nowhere. Okay, so, you love education. Good. Okay. So, couple of sort of preparatory announcements. So, we'll have several things to complete tomorrow. We will be meeting at 1 o'clock. I think it's here in this room. And the session will be a mixture of different activities. One thing is that we'll have to make sure that we know what the assignments are. After tomorrow, I won't be available here, and so we're just going to be sure that we know what they are. And you remember yesterday we discussed the two assignments, one which is the journal activity for everyone, and that will be like a 3-page journal response to the kinds of issues that we've been raising in the class, and it's your description of how you're thinking, how your approach, how your imagination has been shaped by the sort of things we've been thinking about over the last 3 weeks. So it's sort of before and after. I came to class thinking this, not knowing much about that. But now, I wish I had never come, or I'm glad I came because I learned this, this, and this, or it gave me new insights in this and this way. So it's up to you. It's your personal response. Everybody can do it, and that is one of the. That's the requirement for everyone, and the date will determine, and you'll be told about the date tomorrow. And the other is the essay, which will be about 10 pages, and that's an analytical piece in which you have to bring together both. Do you remember what you have to bring together? Explanans, explanandum. Explanandum, the thing to be explained, the phenomenon that you want to explore, the process, the practice, the event, the whatever, empirical reality, with some evidence from published materials, which can include published materials in newspapers and online, just to show that there is a real empirical event or practice or process going on here. But it also has to have the explanans, the concept, the theory, the idea that you have picked up during this 3-week class that helps explain, interpret, that gives you a handle for understanding what it is that you're going to try to discuss and argue about. And it is an argument, because in the essay you're trying to persuade the reader that something is the case, and this is why it is the case. Or that this is the case, and the best way to understand it, or a very good way to understand it, is to use this concept, which I learned during March 2015. Okay, so that's the other one. And again, the dates will confirm tomorrow. So there'll be a kind of official version of that from Dr. Lourdes or from Jumana. And that will happen tomorrow. And then tomorrow, apart from whatever else happens, there will be sort of the last opportunity to ask specific questions of me. And really, I'm very happy for you to ask those questions, because I will be out of here very soon afterwards. And I'll be sorry to go, because we've enjoyed our time here. I will miss you, because we actually had quite a lot of fun together. So, I'm not going because I'm tired of being here. I'm going because I have other things that I have to do. And but it will be the last chance for you to just ask questions of me in this context. So really, if you have questions, you should ask. And that really means, at best, that you think about them beforehand. And I don't care if you ask questions either about what I have said or things that I have not said that you might want to know about that may be helpful to you. So normally, if it's something like a lecture, I prefer it if people ask questions about what I've said than what I have not said. But in this case, I'm happy for people to ask any sorts of questions that you want to, that you think would be helpful either in understanding the surveillance studies specifically, or in understanding other things about, being in academic life, working in the university, being a student in a context like this. What sorts of perspectives and practices might be appropriate? You already heard me give a comment in my lecture this afternoon about what I think about the university and what opportunities there are here. And I don't like to miss the opportunity to say we are in the university for some important purposes. And it's a great privilege to be in a university. Some people, like me, are very, very privileged because I got to be a student for all my life and stay in the university all my life, and I am very grateful for the privilege of having been a student for all my life. I couldn't imagine when I was an undergraduate student that somebody would actually let me stay in the university forever, but they did. And but with that privilege comes great responsibility, and you also have responsibilities. And if you want to talk about those responsibilities, then tomorrow, ask your questions. Be ready. So any kinds of questions. There's no question that is inappropriate. There are many questions that I cannot answer, but there are no questions that I will not answer, or at least try to. Okay? So, to this afternoon. I said that we would simply look at the kinds of things that I was saying in the lecture, and you can ask questions that relate to my talk this afternoon. You heard some people's questions, and they may not have been your questions, so now's the time to ask your own questions. So I called my talk Surveillance and the Settler Colonial Gaze, Monitoring and Managing in Israel-Palestine. The very first part of it was just a sort of summary of some key ideas. Then I talked about population management and biopolitics in the work of Eliezer, and talking about the elevated vantage point, the gaze from above that objectifies and fixes identities, the role of new technologies, and the new book from Eliezer, which I think is going to be create quite a stir and make a strong contribution. I talked about the development of the colonial gaze a little bit. Well, at least I pointed to the fact that there has been a long development. I didn't really expand on it. And I gave examples from one or two sources, one that you'd heard before, another that you hadn't heard before. And then the case that we were talking about yesterday, or the situation we were talking about yesterday, that in many cases the colonial situation is one in which technologies of repression and control and so on are ones that are tested first in the colonial environment. Then I talked a little bit more specifically about settler colonialism, suggesting some characteristics from Patrick Wolfe, each of which has implications for thinking about surveillance. The way that it refers to real social structures, not just to events or unconnected situations. It indigenizes settlers. In other words, it turns settlers from outside into apparently indigenous people, and at the same time turns those who are indigenous into those who are apparently strangers, aliens, outsiders. So it creates a transfer of roles. And then thirdly, it has to do with the elimination of the native. Your history professor, who was over here asking a question this afternoon, suggested that the concept of sociocide is a better one than elimination of the native, because it talks about the demolition, the dismantling of social relations and the making impossible of social life, so that in the end the aim is to persuade people that they have nothing left here because all their supports have gone and the only thing they can do is leave. So sociocide may be a better concept. As I say, I'm not an expert in the area. I was persuaded to give a talk like this afternoon. Very happy to, but I'm not a world expert on colonialism or settler colonialism. Sorry, what were you saying? No, the guy over here teaches history. Okay, political science, but background in history, whatever. Okay, like me, background in history. And I talked about the way in which the chairperson this afternoon, Ahmed Saidi, has done this work on what he calls the discourse of the Israeli discourse of the Palestinian. And then I suggested later on how that develops into what Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian discusses in her work. So there was a sort of continuity, or an attempt at continuity, in what I was saying from my different sources, from Zurich through Ahmed Saidi through to Shalhoub-Kevorkian. So what else was I talking about? Oh, and then I moved right through to, showing the ways in which the social sorting, the categorization is crucial, especially in this settler colonial context where the subdivisions and increasingly minute subdivisions are part of that splitting apart, that disintegrating of Palestinian society. And then to the work of Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian and her feminist critique of surveillance as it applies especially to women and children, to family life in the home, to homes themselves and whether they stand or are demolished, through to experiences like in the street and in the school and in many other local contexts. And really I find her work very refreshing for its concern with the sexualized body of the Palestinian. And immediately you are obliged to realize in reading her work, if you hadn't thought of it before, that this is a world of women, men and children, and women, men and children are all crucially affected by the kinds of surveillance regimes and the associated repression and violence that goes with them. Her work on rape as a strategy of colonial violence is pretty difficult reading. If you haven't read any of that stuff, it is pretty tough going. But it's really important that it actually gets written and that she shows the evidence for it. And I'm very, very pleased to have her as a colleague and friend. And then I finished up by talking a little bit about the prospects for resistance and change and the need for thinking ethically and in terms of justice, remembering why these issues are important. It's easy to get wrapped up with the situation itself, with just the visceral reality of settler colonialism, but we need to remember why they're important and what the sorts of alternatives are that we really care about and that we really want. It's easy just to angrily identify the negative aspects. We also need to have a vision of the better situation that we seek and what it is that we would like to, what kind of society we would like to live in, as opposed to that which is directed by settler colonialism. Anyway, that was my talk in brief for any of you that missed it or, had a very important text message during my talk. So, questions. What things did you want to raise from that lecture? And I'd quite like you to answer a question of mine. in amongst all this. And my question is, did you think that what I was saying helped to describe and understand the situation as you understand it? Or are there some important things that you think I'm missing? Okay, so there's my question for you. You can help me to understand things better. So, again, anything goes, yeah. I noticed you had the microphone strategically close to you there.
No, it's by coincidence.
Just kidding.
So, I don't want to say that you've missed something, but I want to refer to your colleague and friend, Dr. Shalhoub, whom I know personally also. I know that Dr. Shalhoub focuses on the feminist side of maybe, let's say, occupation, maybe surveillance, etc., etc. But isn't it taking things out of context, focusing on one group that's being targeted, while this is not the only group being targeted by Israeli occupation, not only by surveillance, but by other measures?
That it? Good. Okay. Yeah, good question. What I said is what I really think about that question, which is this: that there are many descriptions of all kinds of situations that relate to surveillance in a settler colonial context, that relate to violent relationships and to repressive relationships between colonizer and colonized. But the emphasis has been traditionally on the kind of key sites, for example, of surveillance and control. So the wall, the checkpoints, the border, the whole apparatus. And we understand in rather more fragmented ways how everyday lives are affected by those surveillance technologies and systems. And what I think that the feminist perspective, with its focus on the domestic and the home and the involvement of all family members, women, children, men, generations, grandparents, grandchildren, and so on, helps to redress an imbalance, actually, where the focus has tended to be on responses to what is in fact a very masculinist kind of repressive agency, and responses to that which are often from a sort of male perspective and not from the point of view of people who are equally and certainly no less affected, meaning children especially, women, grandparents, whatever. So I think it helps to redress a balance, in fact. And the feminist perspective is at its base one that acknowledges the full humanity of women in relation to all other human beings. And in patriarchal kinds of contexts, the position of adult males is superior, and therefore one that picks up the everyday lives of all others as well as adult males, I think is tremendously important. The way that she does it is tremendously significant, I think, connecting the violence of colonial powers over territory and whole communities with the violence of individual men and groups of men over female Palestinian bodies, I think is a very poignant way of understanding the dynamics that are going on here. As I say, I find it pretty excruciating reading to read the stuff that she's describing. But I think it's important that she expose it, and I think it helps to, as it were, round out our picture of the sort of full consequences of settler colonialism. So yeah, I've taken the view for many years that feminism is an important perspective, vital to the social sciences, and that I know that some feminists don't agree with this view, but I've taken the view that women and men ought to be feminists. So I take the view that if feminists allow me to be a feminist, I'll be a feminist too, because I think it's so important for the full humanity of all human beings. And when I talk about, human flourishing in every area, I mean human flourishing in every area, which also means for every person. Children, grandparents, women, men, everyone. It's so easy for us to reduce that to something less. So I hope that helps.
You, at the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned, or you brought up how surveillance and security could eliminate politics, if I wrote that correctly, to an extent. And it was just a minute ago that I kind of connected the dots in my head and saw that it's almost like security has eliminated politics here in Palestine, where we can't really negotiate with the Israelis. Everything is based on their security, and politics has been eliminated out of that equation. So do you think that's also the future? Like, because when you said that kind of implied in a way of like that's the future of surveillance. That's where surveillance is taking us, to a security state. Do you believe that would also be implied in like, okay, we already know that we're colonized and we have a higher power, but is this like the future of modern states as well? A state where politics and saying politics is a place where different groups and people go to fight for their interests, and that is no longer there. The interest is security only, purely.
Yeah, life under the sign of security is one that tends to shut out the very possibility of politics. It certainly reduces the possibilities of democracy, democratic politics, but there's a sense in which if security has become the rationale for governmental life, then it pushes out all alternative forms of rationale for governmental life. The response of Ahmad at the end of the talk was also a good one. He pointed out that there are other concepts of security. You remember when I was talking about security earlier on, I observed that security is frequently undefined. It's defined with a qualifier, national, but what is national security? If you're told that something is there for national security, does that mean that you will be safer? Sorry, no. National security does not make you safer. It makes it safer for corporations to trade and to move their goods and whatnot around the world. It makes it safer for high-level political figures to move around and have their conferences and debates and whatnot. National security has a pretty minimal effect on the actual safety of ordinary people. And another concept entirely is human security. So a social theorist, a sociologist like Mary Kaldor, K-A-L-D-O-R, Mary Kaldor writes about human security. Completely different concept. This is security of the person in a place with others, like their families. This is security from fear, not of fear. This is security to make a living. This is security to know that if you are unwell, there are medical services available where you have an equal opportunity to go with everybody else, etc. Human security. I know it sounds like another world. It is another world. But to answer your question, Darar, is this the future of surveillance more generally? It's heading that way. I think security has become the central and single most powerful driver of surveillance. Understood as technology-based and anti-terror, widely defined kinds of surveillance. Yeah. But I also said at the end of my lecture that global mass surveillance, security, national security as the only sign under which government activity works, none of these things are inevitable. No situation that we have created is irreversible. These are human creations. They solidify into very powerful structures, but that still doesn't mean that there aren't ways in which they can be redirected, subverted, dismantled, questioned, politically contested. There are many opportunities, and I wouldn't want to shut those down at all. But yeah, if your question is security-based surveillance becoming a key mode of political or government policy action? Yes. Far beyond Israel-Palestine? Yes. Everywhere? Yes. But that means that social scientists, people who are students of this stuff, could be analyzing it, thinking it through, looking for the openings, arguing for why this has come to be and what other kinds of possibilities there might be. You heard the story that I was telling this afternoon of the development of Israeli policy and the discourse of the Palestinian, as Ahmed calls the policies that developed from 1948. This is something that's developed over a very long time. It will not be dismantled overnight. Nobody anticipated that the Berlin Wall would come down in 1989. But it did, and it is still coming down. It isn't down yet. 1994, apartheid was overcome in South Africa. Did that end apartheid? No, it didn't. But did it offer new openings for change that are still being discussed, debated, fought over in South Africa? Yeah, it does. Are the prospects better in South Africa than they were in 1993? Yes, they are. So however invincible and all-pervading a system seems to be, it doesn't mean that it's inevitable. It doesn't mean that it's irreversible. So I think it's really important to stress that. Let's just let one or two other people have a go at Aurora, and then we can come on. Now, the people who've asked questions so far have asked questions in English. You should not feel at all that you can't ask a question because you're not going to ask it in English. So please feel free to ask it in Arabic, and I will listen to Mary telling me what you're saying. So do we have any other questions apart from those in English? I can see the English speakers, but okay. Oh, that's the way to get your question in, right? Ask it in Arabic. There you go.
وانت يعني أثناء حديثك عن موضوع السياسات الحيوية إن نسميها هيك البايو في موضوع الاستعمار. اوكي انت حكيت يعني ممكن بعرفش المدى اللي ممكن احنا نعتبر فيه يعني تحكم الجانب الاسرائيلي بخلينا نحكي الموارد المائيه، الطاقه، الكهرباء، هاي الامور كلها وتوريدها برضو يعني بكميات معينه للجانب الفلسطيني سواء كان بغزه او برضو بالضفه، ممكن نعتبره من جانب انه هو برضو الرقابه الحيويه اللي بتمارسها على الجانب الفلسطيني طالما انه هي بتتم بحد أقل من حتى الاحتياج الفعلي الموجود بهاي المناطق، فبالتالي هي تقريبا تتحكم كمان بآلية استخدامها يعني بشكل متقدم، كونه أنه هي كمان مش حتروح غير بس للاستخدامات أو الاحتياجات الأساسية الموجودة. هاي النقطة. نقطة ثانية بعرفش يعني كنت بفكر بموضوع انه الرقابة يلي بيتم ممارستها سواء كان بشكل عالمي اذا طلعنا عليها او يعني على يعني مستوى محلي، هل هي بتخلق وعي مختلف للافراد بيتوائم مع اساليب هاي الرقابة؟ يعني بتعمل اعادة انتاج بمدركات الافراد ولا انه بالطريقة اللي عن جد بتتوائم معها؟ يعني وعي إدراك مختلف بتوصل لهاي المرحلة، يعني سواء كان بإطار إن نحطها باستعمار أو حتى إنه هي يعني الحكومات الوطنية، خلينا نحكي يعني الحكومات الموجودة. بس thank you.
Great, thanks, Saja. It's kind of a difficult question. The biopolitics has to do with the management of the population. And usually it's thought of in a more direct way. That is to say, the ways in which populations can be statistically enumerated, classified in particular ways, given opportunities or not, depending on the classification, given opportunities to travel, for example, mobility is restricted in more and less tight ways, and all those kinds of things. So generally it's thought of, biopolitics relates to the ways that populations are managed. Now, as with any other kind of population management, it can't really be thought of outside of a context of control over land and water, and energy for that matter. So there are important ways in which those are connected, and even ways in which surveillance over power, land and water may connect with the surveillance and also connect with the biopolitical control more directly. And you know, while I know a little bit about the ways in which water is diverted, land is appropriated, energy is restricted, etc., in Palestine as opposed to areas of the same territory that is controlled by Israel, it's not quite the same thing, but I wouldn't for a moment suggest that it's not vitally concerned. Obviously, if it's the means of life that we're talking about, then water, land, energy are crucial to it. So, you know, that might be a long-winded way of saying I'm not sure that I know the answer to the question. But it's also a way of saying that however we discuss surveillance, it can't be disconnected from the realities of daily life. And then, there again, that's why I think Shalub Kevorkian's work is so important, because it reminds us of the ways that surveillance is tied up with people's life chances, well, actually, life and death chances. In her work, looking at the deceased Palestinian body and the control and surveillance and control over the dead body, and her focus on births and the capacity to give birth in safety. She tells an awful story somewhere about about a Palestinian woman in her 30s giving birth, and she arrives at the hospital because she had to go to a hospital to have the baby, and forget the embodied person that is made visible by those data. And so if I were to say, oh yeah, they're just separate questions, surveillance is one question, biopolitics, blah, 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 is one question, the real lives of people are another, then that would deny everything that I'm saying about surveillance. Insofar as it is inappropriately done, it is reducing human beings in relation, embodied, to the abstract, objectified, fixed identities, blah, blah, blah. And that's the issue. Anyway, I think that Dolly was next, were you? You can ask it in Arabic if you want. You'll come next.
Well, actually, you mentioned part of the points that I was going to bring about concerning the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the apartheid in South Africa. And so what I was saying when I imagined the picture that one of my teachers when I was in school, he told me, don't worry, I think you should imagine at least that the wall, that the separation wall one day will fall. That's the thing that you have to do at this point. So, and I think that imagining that these situations came to an end, when we witnessed people were brought to awareness about the important, crucial influence of this method of surveillance on their everyday life basis. So they came to the point of resistance to it, and they succeeded with ending the situation. As for us, when I imagine the Palestinian side situation, I think of it as it's not that easily, that it won't be that easily achieved. Especially that it's very difficult. The type of the occupation that we're having in Palestine, it's crucial, and it's based on being occupational and with colonialism approaches. It's both of them. It's about taking lands. It's about changing names. It's about demolishing many areas around. It's very hard to imagine a situation where you're you end this intense kind of surveillance. So I think it needs. When I think about solutions to this situation, I think we have to think about the ends, not the means. The ends is that we have to have awareness of what we need. What are the key points for us to think how to end this situation of massive control that is practiced among us, among the Palestinians in general. And we can see every day in our lives that we see how surveillance is very hugely affecting every action that we do every day. Maybe each as we're sitting here, maybe we are surveilled intensely, different from any other kind of surveillance that we might imagine. So that's what I want to talk about. And I wanted to add another point concerning the Palestinian issue. It has roots and echo in the past, and it's since when the European division of this region and they made it legitimate by the treaties, international treaties, such as Sykes-Picot or San Remo, that gave legitimacy of the existence or the Balfour promise for the Israel, for the Jewish people who were were in Europe to come over and to colonize this area. It's a very not easy. It's not easily perceived, the situation in Palestine. And no, we have a lot to do concerning raising the awareness of the people of redefining surveillance in the Palestinian cause. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean the case of the Berlin Wall and the end of apartheid are good ones to think about in this context, because they too were very heavily dependent on very extensive surveillance mechanisms. They were each what you might call surveillance states. And there was constant surveillance of all kinds, the highest technology that was available in each country at that time, combined with the use of informers, collaborators, and so on and so forth, in both cases. And to see the ways in which surveillance helped to maintain those very repressive regimes over massive populations, different circumstances, of course, but over massive populations is very instructive. So, and equally, just as you were saying about the weight of settler colonialism here, if you talk to students in South Africa or students in East Germany, you would have heard the same kind of thing. The weight of this system is so huge, it can never break open. It so dominates our lives that there's no way that we can see anything past this. Well, there were some people in both places that saw past it and believed in the possibility that this was not the only reality possible. And there were some extremely courageous people in both places who took that whole business very seriously. One of the professors who taught me sociology in 1968 and 1969 when I was an undergraduate was a guy called Harold Wolpe. And Harold Wolpe was an exile from South Africa. He was no longer able to stay in South Africa because of the work that he was doing. And if you read the biography of Nelson Mandela, which is called the Long Walk to Freedom, you'll find in that book that Harold Wolpe was the key social and political theorist for his understanding of the potential role of the ANC in South Africa. He depended on social science, people with a social science background to help him, Nelson Mandela, understand why, for example, you couldn't look at capitalism in South Africa only in terms of class. Marxists for years had gone on about class as the key category. Harold Wolpe argued, nonsense. If you're going to be a true Marxist in this time in South Africa, you have to think about race and class and their intersection together before you understand a thing. You won't get it if you think only about class. So he needed a social political theorist to help him understand the situation and to help maintain the vision of an alternative future that was possible and certainly desirable. So, there's an important role for that kind of thinking. If you think only in terms of worst case scenarios and the continuation and intensification of the same system, if that's the only thing that fills your imagination, where will you ever get any sense of what other things might be possible? In 2004, Sue and I went to the World Social Forum, which that year was in Mumbai. in India. Hundreds of thousands of people there. It was the craziest event you could imagine. And everybody had a cause that they were supporting. Everybody was carrying a flag for something. But their slogan, the World Social Forum, this is the alternative to the World Economic Forum that meets in Davos in Switzerland every year. The World Social Forum slogan is, "Another world is possible." And if we don't have that kind of imagination, if we don't think about the other world that is possible, how can we ever work towards it, fight for it, argue for it, discuss it, protest in favor of it? How can we ever do that if we can't imagine the reconstitution of our society in a different way? If we think only of the worst case scenario, if we only think that this system will go on forever, if I can only think that Stephen Harper will continue forever to be the Prime Minister of Canada, what hope is there? Really? We've got to think beyond about the other possibilities. Beyond. We've got to believe that another world is possible. And we're active human beings with imaginations. We can find small openings and different ways forward. We can equally, eventually, when those opportunities come, find the bigger openings and walk through them. So, if we only think of worst case scenarios, the Orwellian, miserable 1984, it leads to paralysis or apathy or complacency or resignation. That's not going to get us anywhere, is it? But if we can dream of the alternative future, then we can start to think about, well, how would we reconstitute society? What exactly is it that we're fighting for? What's the most important thing that we want to build into our new social policies, our new living arrangements, our new coexistence in what they once called Israel, or what they once called the occupied territories? Can we imagine a different situation? We're human beings. We have the capacity to imagine and to think about and to think ethically and critically about another future. Another world is possible. You have a question. Khalil.
Just a point I want to raise, because I have many thoughts about this, what we said through 3 weeks. I want to say that there were a monopoly in the technology in the Cold War, and after that, for a few years later, that what we call it, that caused the global centralized surveillance. After that, about being the products like iPhone and other technologies being used by everybody, we can use it anywhere and anytime. It become more decentralization in global surveillance, and the surveillance become more what you call it, have a voice. In the past, it's just a silent surveillance, and there is actions, and there is a voice for the surveillance. Through the new technology, we can use that create a new society and a new world we are live with. So in this world, we are just ethically, and we what we call it, we just accept for being watched, and we have a thing that it is ethical in a way or another. It's in my opinion that it's a time we should rethink in freedom, human rights, and these methodologies, because we are living in a new world. In my vision, maybe in a few years later, I will see a big screen for the whole world, and as me, a small light in it, that they are see every person in the whole earth. So we should rethink in human rights, in freedom, and what we are going in Because with the iPhone, I can surveillance like my wife in the future, where she is, and there is an application. You can track your girlfriend and know where she is. And there is many technology we can use it. So it becomes more acceptance that we are living under the light and being watched, like what the real TV shows.
Yeah.
And many people would like to join these TV shows, and they think that they are celebrity in a way or another. This is the new world we are living in. So we should rethink in the concept and methodologies and these things for our future.
Yeah, but we also have to think critically within that situation, don't we, Khalil? I mean, sure, the ways in which the world is being remade at the moment in relation to the new technologies of communication and information is a mixed blessing. I mean, some things are really very positive and other things are very negative indeed. So within that situation, we have to think about our own practices, our own, what it is that we use our machines for, whether we end up echoing the surveillant uses by powers that we disapprove and disagree with in our own practices. So, there again, I think there are ways in which our own local practices need to develop in new ways. And we need to talk about how we use our cell phones and internet and... No. Okay. We're running out of time. We've got a question time tomorrow. And I've invited you to think about your questions and formulate them. And they can be questions about what we've talked about and what we haven't talked about. And you're welcome to bring your questions tomorrow. And if you have planned them, you can even tell me in advance if you have a question and, book your space. But there is a question time tomorrow. Right now, we need to give Mary a rest and let her finish for the day. We're very grateful to Mary for her help with the translation, without which we would not get very far. And I need to wish you a good evening, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you. Shukran lakum.